Good afternoon, everyone. I know this is a very interactive session with networking and lunch. If I can have please your attention, we are ready to start our next panel. So please take a chair and let's get started. Okay, and welcome. Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Trushar Patel. I'm from the University of Lethbridge, whose indigenous name is Iniscum, meaning Sac at Buffalo Stone. I'm an associate dean and Canada Research Chair in RNA Biophysics. It is my great privilege today to start this panel. It is extremely timely given the current climate that we see on a daily basis. The title of the panel is Articulating the Value of Science in a Turbulent International Landscape. As I said, this topic is extremely timely considering what is happening around us and what affects us globally and locally. And I'm very thankful to Dr. Chad Gaffel, who has organized this panel. So I'll give a very quick introduction and we get going. Dr. Gaffel is an executive director of U15, one of the prestigious organizations that helps advocating and putting universities' perspective to the community and to government. He is a distinguished professor at the University of Ottawa, Order of Canada, and Fellow of the Royal Society of Canada. So before we get going, I just want to give a couple of housekeeping announcements. This session will be taking questions through your app. So please download CSPC app. There is a Q&A section in there. Please send your questions there. It'll be moderated online. So please use app to download the questions. You can also download the app to do English and French translations, interpretation, so use that app. One of the important announcements is that there is a celebration of Francophonie reception today at 5:30 p.m. at Province's Ballroom and Foyer. So please join in the reception celebrating that event. It is very important to us. Please socialize this event online using your favorite social media platform and hashtagging CSPC 2024. And please take time to appreciate all the exhibitors and all the sponsors who have took a lot of time and came here with all of their supplies to communicate with you. So they are all at the exhibits room. So take your time and visit them. And without a further ado, let's give a big round of applause for our panel and U15 colleagues.
Right here. Right here? Yeah.
It's okay.
Perfect. Thank you. Okay, thank you. Well, bonjour à tous et toutes. It's great to see you. Thank you so much for coming and joining us. Thanks for that warm introduction. It's great to be here. This session is an attempt to really think through a little bit a world that we see this word turbulent associated with all the time. We see the words like uncertainty and so on. But I think we're all obviously keen to not just be spectators to this, but to get in and actually try to create the futures that we want. And we're just delighted to have two people who I think have done that on the inside and the outside and seen it from so many really important places. And in my mind, I think one of the key things is that they know our campuses really well. Rachel Curran and Sean Spear have both instructed in our universities, have done graduate degrees on our universities and so on, and have been intimately connected to our world for many years now. And I think that's a great help. But it's not just that. They've also been on the inside in terms of political decision making. Rachel, I remember back to being in the PMO and working there. Sean, finance and in the PMO. So there's just a lot of knowledge there and experience in terms of that decision making process. The other thing I think is so interesting is their kind of real sense of that changing global landscape. That is to say, both of them work globally in many ways, and I think that's been really, really important. The specifics at the moment, as you know, Rachel has been working for Meta Canada as head of public policy and has taken time out today. We really appreciate your coming here. And Sean, I can say many things about Sean, but the thing that all of us have become really aware of is his key role now as an editor-at-large at The Hub, something that pretty quickly became a go-to kind of podcast and engager in terms of the kind of town square debates that we really need to have in Canada. So I think we're really well situated. So I wanted to just start off with that question of, okay, we've got this turbulent world, we got these words like uncertainty and so on. Can we say something about the kind of value proposition of the world of research and innovation, science? How can we contribute to this and think about it in ways that are really going to help respond to this 21st century as it's evolving? Rachel, can I start with you?
Well, yeah, there's a lot in that question. But what is the value proposition? So, Chad, we talk about how can we communicate our value proposition. So what is it? I haven't heard a lot about it publicly. I'm, of course, personally a big supporter of our university system and of our research ecosystem. And I know a lot about it, having worked in the Harper government. But Canadians generally, I think, support our universities. They are generally of the view that a post-secondary education is kind of the doorway to success and to prosperity, especially for younger Canadians. But I would not say, and you can correct me if I'm wrong on this, I would not say Canadians are generally aware of the value proposition of research institutions or of research generally. So what is it about what universities are doing, what research institutions are doing that is good for regular Canadians? And you've heard Mr. Poilievre say this when he speaks to the business community, sometimes in fairly harsh terms. You lay the groundwork for what you do. Don't expect me to carry the water for what you do. Don't expect me to explain to Canadians why what you do is important. You do it, and then come to me with the proposed policy changes that you want me to take forward. And I think the same is true for universities and research institutions. Have you explained to Canadians why what you are doing is important and how it impacts their lives in very concrete, tangible, beneficial ways? And I'm not sure I've seen that, Chad. Sean and I are both products of the post-secondary world in Canada. We understand from our own personal experience why post-secondary education is important, why research institutions are important. We have experience in government understanding what institutions are involved in, why their work benefits Canada. But I'm not sure that Canadians more broadly have an understanding of that.
So the point to us and the challenge is for us is to not view ourselves as victims or spectators, but to take control, take agency on this.
Yes.
Sean?
Yeah, Rachel was my boss in the Prime Minister's office, so it's probably safest for me to say ditto.
Wow.
But I'm getting paid by the word, so I'll say a bit more. I'm kidding. That was just some salad in a bun. I feel like a bit of an interloper here at a science conference. I have an arts background. I studied at Lakehead in Thunder Bay and then at Carleton here in Ottawa, and have spent the past several years outside of politics, teaching as an instructor at the Monk School of Global Affairs and Public Policy, and now at Carleton University. And so, as Rachel says, I am a product and a creature of the institutions that many of you here represent. I think the question of a value proposition, as Chad put it, is an important one for the group to reflect on, in part because the context has changed a great deal since even our time in office. David Coletto, the Abacus pollster, talks increasingly about what he characterizes as a scarcity mindset, which is to say, I think a lot of Canadians increasingly feel like we're living in a zero-sum world. That relates, of course, to public finance and government budgeting. Provinces are increasingly seeing healthcare represent something like 50% or more of discretionary program spending. Ottawa has various demands, including, of course, the need to increase defense spending in light of some of the global uncertainty that Chad talked about. So in that context, the challenge for the sector is, for a long time, the value proposition was self-evident, and the environment was tilted in the direction of investment. In a world in which, as Rachel says, the case is it may be perceived as less self-evident, and the context is one of competing demands on public finances, there is an onus on the sector to, I think, be introspective about the way it thinks and talks about itself and its ability to make claims on scarce resources. We're here amongst some of the country's leading scientists doing some of the most path-breaking work in the country, and I look forward, if time permits, to talk a bit about that and its importance. But I will take up something Rachel said, which is, I think when most Canadians think about the sector, they think about it principally through the lens of its education and training mission, and not necessarily as much about its research and innovation mission. Again, it's not to diminish that second part, but I do think the sector, for the better part of the past 2 decades, has talked and thought about itself focused on research and innovation, and probably at the expense of the mission, at least as how Canadians tend to interpret it. And so if I was advising the sector, the risk of being presumptuous, I think in this new scarcity context, there'll be an onus to adjust or balance the way it thinks and talks about itself, not necessarily at the expense of its research and innovation mission, but by elevating the education and training part of what you do. We've seen extensive polling that shows that Canadians are insecure or self-conscious about the future of their children. That's an entry point for this sector to talk about itself as an engine of intergenerational mobility. And that is principally through its education and training lens. So it seems like a funny thing to say at a science conference, and indeed I think we ought to speak about the importance of the work that's being done with respect to research and innovation. But I do think that in this new and evolving context, the way you'd think and talk about these different parts of your mission need to adjust.
I think that's such a great point, and I think one of the reasons why we've been emphasizing so much the ROI of the development of highly qualified talent through research. And I must say, both of you are so well, I think, positioned to help us today. Why? Because, in fact, you've shown how your undergraduate choices, your graduate choices, and so on, laid the foundations for wonderfully successful careers and real leadership positions. I always have to say when I get near Sean, we're always thrilled because he chose history. And I've read his thesis, his MA thesis, by the way, which is a really interesting study of the Tom DeCino's years at the Business Council and so on. It's a really
now I know who read it
today.
Besides my mom.
Yeah. And in Rachel's case, before she went to law, she did English and classics at University of Victoria. UVic, as you may know, has wonderful departments of English and of classics, and then went on to do her master's at Queen's in English literature. And so I emphasize that a little bit because one of the things we hear about in terms of the value proposition and so on is those arts degrees. What are those humanities, social sciences, and so on? Is the value proposition, if we turn it to talent piece and so on, and think about the kind of human capital aspect of that, should that include all disciplines? Or, how do we think about that? Rachel?
Oh gosh, that's a tough question. Yeah, of course. I mean, the real value, and I've said this to you before, Chad, I love our university system in Canada because no matter where you live in the country, you can get an excellent undergraduate education. And that's very different from the US or the UK or a lot of our international peers. Our university system is much more egalitarian. So you can get from a university that doesn't have a great international reputation or isn't on the kind of international radar, you can get a really top quality education. And that's going to catapult you to opportunities in Canada and internationally that, you know, kind of the world's your oyster. So how do you communicate that value proposition to Canadians? And how do you communicate the value of a liberal arts education, which is certainly what I had? And how do you explain to Canadians that these are valuable programs, these universities that aren't, part of the U15, or part of, international rankings. They don't appear anywhere on these lists. Why are they valuable, and why should governments continue to contribute to them and fund them? So I think there's a real case to be made for the quality of education that Canadians are getting. And frankly, I see Canadians coming out of these universities. I work at Meta now, which is a global company. I see Canadians coming out of these universities who are getting jobs at Meta, at Google, at Amazon, not just in Canada, but in the US and in the EU. And they were doing that on the strength of the education that they're getting here. And I don't see, look, we can talk about this further. I don't see the value of that being communicated more broadly to Canadians.
I would just say, I understand that our audience here is mixed. There's some administrators, there's some researchers, and then there are some policymakers. And I think there is a takeaway here for policymakers. They need to be cognizant when they're designing programs at the federal level or provincial funding arrangements with institutions, that you're not creating perverse incentives which are compelling institutions to try to fit themselves in a box that doesn't work. We ought to have a policy regime which pushes back against homogenization and leverages the individual strengths and the particular advantages of different institutions. Not every institution ought to be aspiring to be a major research institution. And there's nothing wrong with that. In fact, in a lot of ways, in the new context that is sort of at the backdrop of our conversation, there's an argument that doubling down on excellence in education and training will represent a comparative advantage for those institutions. But that requires, I think, some policy change to ensure that there's the conditions are set for institutions to define who they are and define their value proposition, as you've put it. And then there's a need for almost like a kind of a cultural change within these institutions to be secure in who they are and what their value proposition is. And I think that these two forces working together can actually reinforce the strengths of the system that Rachel's outlined.
And yeah, it's such a good point. You're both emphasizing that we don't talk enough about or really come to grips with in terms of data and so on, the richness of a diversified post-secondary landscape and why this has been working, I would say, well, and Canada's been benefiting in many respects. Let's take this conversation up to the global level, as well as domestic. In Canada, we're going to go through a transition. We know, I think, I can't remember the last incumbent national leader who won that election anywhere in the world now, it seems. Leaders who go back to the polls are going to be in big trouble. So we can expect, I think, in Canada for sure, there's going to be a government transition and so on. I gather from your comments, we need to really embark on a systematic effort to explain what we do, why we do it, how we're contributing, what are the aspects of this. We can't take for granted that people know, or as you say, just are going to appreciate it, take for granted, and so on. How can we do that in a world in which, we hear a lot about, science is kind of on the side, information, misinformation, all those sorts of competition for words like excellence or truth or why one makes decisions and so on. And thinking about a transition to government, what should we have kind of at the front of our minds in terms of articulating this and coming to grips with it and maybe critically thinking about it?
Yeah. So let me challenge a little bit your view that this is just an anti-incumbency wave.
No, it's not.
Sure, it's anti-incumbency in a number of respects, but it's anti-incumbency because the incumbents have failed to produce good results. So bad governance, especially in a context where the external environment is more challenging, has produced real hardship for people. So inflation is kind of top of mind. The fact that, in Canada, it's impossible now for young people to secure housing, to understand that they will have a better quality of life than their parents or their grandparents. Things have gotten worse in a very tangible and concrete way for young Canadians. And so I think, as Sean said earlier, there's a real opportunity for universities and research institutions to say, look, we play a part in ensuring your future success.
Yes.
And this is what the value of what we offer is all about.
Yes.
So it's not just anti-incumbency for incumbency's sake. It's the fact that the incumbents have governed it in a way that have produced bad results and bad outcomes for Canadians and for young Canadians in particular. So there's a reason they're looking for something different. It's because what's been done to date has not been working for them. So that needs to be explained and I think highlighted. And you need to explain why you are part of their future and not part of what hasn't been working in the past. And Sean, I know you want to jump in here too. It's sort of an anti-elite moment. Mm-hmm. And universities are, I think, broadly considered to be part of the kind of elite class, or university administrators, presidents, part of the elite class. But it's anti-elite because what the elites have done has not been good for everyone else, for the people on the ground. And I think that's not the case. That's not the case in Canada. And it doesn't need to be the case going forward. And I think explaining that is going to be critically important.
Yeah, there's so many ways I could follow up. We could talk about some of the unique challenges that the sector has faced, say in the past 13 months or so, and how that's interacted with politics. And we probably ought to talk about that before we wrap up. And I also would like to talk about science, because I do think that there are some entry points with an incoming government to make the case for science investments. And some of the progress that I know is being made around the Bouchard report and bringing greater coherence to the federal science portfolio. But at the risk of sounding like a broken record when it comes to my point about seeing yourselves as on the front lines of intergenerational mobility, and that being a key part of the way you think and talk about yourself, whatever one thinks about Pierre Poilievre's politics, that reasonable people can agree or disagree. I think Pierre Poilievre in a lot of ways represents the best of Canada, by which I mean he was born to a teenage mother, adopted by school teachers in Saskatchewan, and within one lifetime is on the precipice of becoming a G7 leader. Mm-hmm. He often talks about what he describes as the promise of Canada.
And only in Canada could that happen.
Precisely. And I think universities are a major part of that ecosystem of the promise of Canada. And so for those who are doing government relations and public affairs, yes, of course, continue to elevate the tremendous science work that's being done. I don't want to diminish that. But I do think in this context of scarcity, in a context in which people are increasingly unsure about the future, particularly the future of their children, re-establishing the case that if social mobility is your principal priority, then universities are at the center of that agenda. It's a message that will resonate, I think, because it's Pierre Poilievre's story. It's my story. It's Rachel's story. It's the story of a lot of Canadians. And so I think, as I said earlier, it's a bit funny to be making this case at a science conference. But I do think it is a crucial part of success or failure for the sector moving forward. Can it reestablish in the minds of Canadians that in addition to all of the great research and innovation, you are fundamentally in the business of creating the conditions for social mobility in Canada?
And that's so important because, and I think I want to talk just a little bit about the new Trump presidency that's arriving, because we obviously have to learn from that. We have to come to grips with what happened there and why, and kind of embrace that. And I think one of the lessons is exactly Rachel and Sean, both of you are saying, is that, the kind of sense that the system now is not cultivating that kind of opportunity. I mean, I look at now my grandkids who are coming through this, and what I was able to do, $600 a year at McGill.
Yes.
And the equation that I remember well was you could earn enough in the summer,
Yes.
working hard,
Yes.
to go to school in the winter.
Yes.
You might have to work an extra 10 hours in the winter and so on, but it was possible. So you didn't have to, have rich parents. You didn't have to, that thing about making sure you choose your parents right, because if you don't, you're really screwed. But that's kind of what you're saying, is that we got into this position. So I think this notion of opportunity and so on. Okay, but let's talk about, we've been talking a lot recently about the election results in the US. Are there, out of that, can we learn and think about these issues in ways that have a crispness that are really important to us?
Sean, you take that first.
I think that that universities are institutions and communities with a multitude of backgrounds and perspectives. The Canadian pluralism is manifest on your campuses, and that's obviously an inherent strength. But it's also, of course, meant that you've been on the front lines of grappling with some of the biggest challenges our society is facing in real time. It's not a surprise to anyone here, of course, who've seen this play out in their communities. I think one of the challenges that the sector has faced in communicating with the political class and the broader public about how you've sought to manage those issues is you haven't let us in, which is to say you haven't helped us understand how you think about them, what it means to be a pluralistic community, what are the kind of limits to pluralism in your community. I think, for instance, of the controversial congressional appearances of some of the major university presidents who didn't let people in. They relied on talking points and so on. Whereas I think what we need to understand, what we want to hear, is how you think about these trade-offs within your community. How do you manage pluralism well? You're microcosms of a question that we're asking ourselves at the more macro level in a society increasingly marked by diversity broadly defined, not just diversity in the complexion of the country, but diversity in our understanding of the good life and all of the rest. So it's a very long way of saying, I think as long as the sector is not prepared to kind of let us collectively in to the challenges a president or executives are facing and kind of thinking about these issues and how to do pluralism well, I think you're going to buck up against a degree of skepticism, a degree of uncertainty that is not in the interests of the sector as a whole for making your case that we've been talking about.
And presumably that transparency, some of you may have read the David Brooks article in
Yes.
the Atlantic,
Yes.
and you just go down the list, the 6 sins he talks about in really critiquing pretty heavily the university system in the U.S. And particularly the elite institutions in the U.S., the Ivy Leagues and so on. The game is rigged. The meritocracy has created an American caste system and so on. And exactly the opposite of this opportunity, no matter who you are, if you're bright, you want to work hard and so on, you'll be able to have that kind of social mobility, saying, no, the game's been rigged. How do we deal with that? Transparency is definitely going to be part of this, but this is pretty serious.
But Canada uniquely does not have that caste system,
Right?
Like we're very different from the US and the UK and others in that respect. We don't have a political elite that comes out of a academic elite, for better or for worse. And we should really, I think, emphasize the fact that we are a much more egalitarian society in that respect. And our political class is drawn from a range of folks, some with university education, some not. But we don't depend on this kind of elite class coming out of an Ivy League system.
Pedigree.
Yeah, pedigreed class to rule the country.
Right.
And I think that potentially makes us a much more functional, but also much more stable society. And universities have a key role to play in that. And I think we actually need to kind of lean into that. The other, I think, risk of a Trump presidency is that he's going to do what he said he would do and apply tariffs across the board to economies outside of the US, including Canada. So that's an existential threat for us. And I know there are lots of folks thinking about how to deal with trade issues, including potential tariffs. But we, I think, have a chance to distinguish ourselves and offer a different value proposition from what's being offered currently in the US.
If I could be, sorry, pardon me. Richard.
No, go ahead, John.
I was going to say, if I could be concrete about the point I was trying to make, which I concede was a bit abstract. The Hub was proud a few months ago, I guess now, to publish a speech, a set of remarks that Merrick Gertler gave, where he, I think, really did try to reason through in public the different competing issues and perspectives that he's trying to balance in a context of major normative disagreements playing out on campus. How do you enable people to express themselves on issues that are inherently contentious? How do you ensure safety and security for those who disagree? To what extent are different voices and perspectives enabled to participate in those discussions and debates? At what point does something cross the line from socially protected speech and expression into the realm of criminality? And then what's the role of the institution itself plus authorities to manage those issues? I don't think anyone is under illusion that what many of the institutions here represented are going through. This is tough stuff. And it's not just tough stuff for you, it's tough stuff for the society as a whole. But I think the key is to let us in. Let us know the trade-offs that you're working through. Let us know the different principles or values that are underpinning the choices that you're making. You are part of our communities. And I think the worst thing that can happen to the sector is if people increasingly feel like we're isolated from one another. That especially in a broadly publicly funded system, if my grandfather in Thunder Bay feels disconnected from the university sector, going back to my point about scarcity, if an incremental dollar can go to healthcare or it can go to the sector, he's going to preference healthcare. And so I think the big challenge, particularly in this fraught moment, is to let people in, let people understand what's happening on campus, let people know how you're making these judgments, so they feel like there's a relationship between the institutions and the society that they inhabit.
Yeah, look, Sean said that far better than I did. In an environment where there's an existential economic threat to Canada, we have got to pull together and explain how the various sectors that operate in Canada, healthcare, education, transport, work together to produce our kind of common success and common prosperity. And in the absence of that, we're going to be absolutely not just sidelined, but economically in a very, very difficult position with a much more muscular and aggressive US approach.
It's interesting how it seemed not that long ago, globalization, it's kind of a kumbaya. We're all going to get along. We're going to have intertwined economies, and it was all going to be wonderful. And now what we've learned, I think the pandemic certainly emphasized this, the geopolitical borders make a big difference.
Yes.
And if you don't really cultivate that domestic capacity,
Yes.
then the economic side, the security, the national sovereignty, the whole thing starts to come undone. And one of the thing I think the really key messages is that if we're going to have a strong economy, a strong society, and so on, we need the talent, we need the leaders, we need the kind of capability that will allow us to, yes, engage internationally, but do so from a position of strength. And during the Biden years, we were all scared in Canada. The CHIPS and Science Act seemed really, really great, and then we were really concerned in terms of the vacuuming of our talent and the extent to which we would be kind of become an economic colony at some level if this happened. What you're saying is we have to really kind of center that domestic strength, security, economic kind of stability.
In the context that we're talking about, I think place is going to matter more and more.
Yeah.
And your institutions are global, of course. You're attracting extraordinary global researchers, students, and so on. But you also inhabit place. And I think that the institutions that are going to be most successful moving forward in this environment are ones that can do both, that can look outward, but also are deepening their roots in the places they occupy.
How do we navigate the kind of geopolitical changes? In other words, we had some sessions earlier talking about research security and how do we have the kind of global collaboration that we need. Why? Because most of the local problems have global articulations and so on. How do we engage internationally at the same time, keeping a real eye on the fact that we have to have a strong Canada?
Well, engage with our allies. Like, don't engage with people who are going to pose a national security risk to Canada. I mean, I hate to be blunt about this, but the story about the National Microbiology Lab in Winnipeg was not beneficial for the research sector in Canada, right? Like, I think we have to stop being naive about who our allies are and who aren't our allies. And fortunately, that largely aligns with the US views on who are our allies and who aren't. But we really have to be careful about who we're partnering with and what their motivations are. And sometimes it feels like universities haven't always been clear-eyed about the motivations of those who want to partner with us. And I understand the money's tempting. There are a whole bunch of developing countries who would say, yeah, money looks great. But there are consequences on the other side of that that are not beneficial to Canada. So I think we have to understand in this world of geopolitical uncertainty, but also, I mean, it's pretty certain who's with us and who's not. Figure out who we're partnering with, figure out whether they are allies in terms of our values, and make decisions accordingly, right? Not just on the basis of who's offering a large check, because I think that is going to come back to haunt us, and it already has.
And we've certainly as you say, this has been going on for it's 5, 6, 7 years now of trying to wrestle this. And I think we feel pretty proud that we've developed. I mean, one of the great success stories, my humble opinion, is the creation of the Government of Canada Universities Working Group on Research Security. It took us a long time to get there in terms of trying to work this out, but it was a little bit the way you're both saying. It was really getting a much better knowledge and understanding of each other and these issues. And, you know, we've certainly spent more time dealing with the National Intelligence Agency.
Yeah, well, but the Government of Canada is not unwilling to engage on these things. I don't know how well they do it, but Sean, you remember certainly when we were in government, CSIS and CSE would go out to the private sector and companies and say, look, we recommend you don't install this particular product into your infrastructure because it represents a security threat to Canada. Some private sector companies went ahead and installed that infrastructure or those products into their infrastructure anyway, and are now having to remove it at a cost of billions of dollars. So I think being, clear-eyed about what you're doing and with whom, and speaking to our intelligence agencies about what's a good idea and what isn't a good idea is a good course of action. And I'm not sure, and look, I can't speak to how well the Government of Canada is doing that currently, but in, I think, our experience, those agencies have been very willing to share information, certainly share advice with universities and private sector actors in the past.
Right.
We've been speaking a lot about the inherent risks of the moment we're living in. As time counts down, we should talk a bit about the opportunities, Chad. I'll name drop a bit here, but I know Dr. Bouchard's here, and it's to his credit and the credit of those who contributed to his report, that it's not sitting on a shelf, that we are seeing progress in implementing those recommendations that I think will be to the benefit of Canada's overall science policy regime. I saw Preston Manning here earlier as well. Preston's presence signifies that a focus on these issues of science are actually part of the Conservative Party DNA. That is to say, going back to the current party's legacy parties, there's been an interest in these issues, a recognition that there's a role for government and public policy to support science and innovation as in the national interest. And that issue of national interest, it seems to me, is going to loom even more large in the environment that Rachel has been talking about. The question is, what's the right mix of institutions and resources within the science portfolio broadly to advance our national interests? And I think Dr. Bouchard's proposal to try to bring a horizontal perspective to the way that Ottawa funds research is terribly important. I was saying to Rachel and Chad that in some ways his proposal's ahead of how the government is organized and structured itself, which is to say almost all of the big questions facing our society moving forward are ones that don't fit neatly in any government department or, of course, any faculty on your campuses. Energy transition, Indigenous reconciliation, boosting productivity and getting out of this economic stagnation that we're stuck in, managing our relationship with the world, et cetera, et cetera. All of those are going to draw on different parts of the system and inside the government and different scientists and researchers. And so I'm optimistic that Dr. Bouchard's proposal can start to get at the extent to which you're increasingly interdisciplinary, but the way that the government supports research isn't itself interdisciplinary. The point about Preston Manning and how conservatives think about science and science policy, I think is important for people in the room. Should Pierre Poilievre and the Conservatives get elected, they'll inherit, what, a $9 or $10 billion science envelope. Ostensibly, that's not going to zero. And so they're going to need a framework, a science policy framework to bring coherence to how those resources are allocated. The risk otherwise is they're divorced from the government's broader broader agenda and set of priorities. So I think it seems to me one entry point for people in this room is to say, you're going to inherit $9 billion. What do you want to do with it? How does it fit within your broader governing goals? And what types of institutional reforms along the lines that Dr. Bouchard has set out, or programmatic reforms are necessary to ensure that there is alignment? And as I say, I think that is an entry point, and Preston's presence here ought to reinforce that.
And in fact, my memory suggests that Preston Manning's annual conference is sort of the earlier antecedent of this event, right? I mean, he was the one that had an annual event in Ottawa,
Yes,
focused on science, innovation, and so on. And those conversations, we used to all go to them, and they were a really stimulating kind of event. And I think his presence here is an indication that he feels some genealogy there.
Yeah.
It's a continuing, I think, a lot of that discussion. Can we talk a little bit about, when I first learned your names in government, it was an era when we were creating very aggressive international attempts to position Canada as a home and the real cultivator of the best and brightest. It started with the Vanier scholarships. It started with the Bantine postdoctoral fellowships. It went on to the Canada Excellence Research Chairs and so on. How do we think about programs that really try to pursue excellence, to show that Canada can play a lead role in this, and other kinds of competing priorities? Or how do we think about that? I know that the word elite or excellence, or a lot of these words now are up for grabs at some level. And there are debates about them, and not everyone's a fan anymore. I think of some of that language. I think a lot of us we're very concerned. For example, recently we've been wrestling a lot with the student visa issue, and to be frank, we feel that a lot of our great efforts to build and attract the best and brightest are being kind of collateral damage in policies that are affecting really blunt instruments that are aimed at a whole different set of problems and so on. How do we think about that, and what can we do to sort of ensure that the notion of Canada having a real ability to be a leading country and in fact achieve the kind of economic security and so on, the kind of 21st century that we want, moving up that value chain in terms of our economy and so on, and doing it based on a belief that we can be really competitive, globally competitive?
Yeah, there's a lot in the question. Best and brightest, international students. So why is it important that Canada attracts the best and brightest, right? Why is it important to the average Canadian, to young Canadians in particular, who are looking at a future that looks difficult and pretty bleak at the moment? Why is it important that we attract the best and brightest people here? So I think that needs to be clear to them. And I think that is what Mr. Poilievre has laid out pretty clearly. If we're going to invest in particular areas or outcomes or goals, why is it good for Canadians? Look, you're not going to attract the best and brightest unless everything else is working well too, right? Are you going to be able to attract the best and brightest to Canada if you have a healthcare system that's not operating? Or if you have cities where the streets are congested. With traffic, it's impossible to get anywhere. So all of those other public policy issues, I think, need to be addressed if you're going to pursue that goal as well. But I think explaining why, look, maybe to you, Chad, it's self-evident why we should be attracting the best and brightest people to Canada. I don't think that's self-evident to anyone who's outside of the university sector or the academic sector. So I think explaining that is going to be really important. On the issue of international students, look, I know that's gotten a ton of press. Not all of it, in fact, most of it is not very positive. The narrative, I think, is that universities have gone out of their way to attract international students to Canada, not because they think they're going to improve the quality of education for Canadians, or because they're going to contribute to Canadian society in some way, but because they need the money. So it's a very kind of sort of transactional, we need money to fund our programs because we don't have enough money. Therefore, we're going to get people from overseas who aren't necessarily qualified to be in the programs they're enrolled in to fund our operations. And that's a pretty negative story to tell. For what it's worth, I don't agree with that. I think international students are exactly the kinds of people, by and large, that we want in Canada. They've left their homes, they've left their families, they've left their communities for the prospect of a better life here. And I think, by and large, can contribute enormously to Canada. But they're coming here with that prospect dangled before them. And universities, it seems, are looking at them simply as a cash cow. So I think, look, all of this goes back to kind of terrible mismanagement of the immigration system overall. I think international students are now being unfairly demonized for the failures of management of the immigration system. So I think there needs to be a lot of work and thought put into how to reframe their participation in our educational system and the contribution they can make to this country. Because I think having them here, having them continue to participate in our post-secondary education institutions, and having them stay in Canada with a clear pathway to permanent residence here is critically important. The immigration levels that were announced recently assume that over 1 million people with temporary visas, many of whom are international students, are just going to pick up and leave next year. I don't think that's the case. And I'm actually glad that's not the case, because I think there's a lot they can contribute, but we're going to have to figure out how to incorporate those people into the labor markets, how to ensure that they stay here and that there's a clear path to permanent residence, and how to explain to Canadians that, yes, there's a temporary pressure on other infrastructure, including housing, but it's for good reason, and here's why. And I think universities have a key role to play in that. At this point, you're sort of perceived as beneficiaries of international students who are willing to pay large amounts to study in Canada and potentially remain here. I think that whole narrative needs to be reframed, and urgently.
And it makes me, these comments make me think as well of, and in fact connects to both your earlier comments and Sean's metaphor about the horizontal connecting of so many things. Because one of the points, I think, is the fact that higher education, and certainly the world of research and innovation, has evolved as de facto a federal, provincial, shared responsibility.
Yes.
But there's just nowhere that we're having this kind of conversation. Yes. So we can have, I think, provincial provinces pursuing policies that in many ways fly in the face of what the federal government is trying to do. And this is, it seems to me, a real challenge that if we've been having a conversation, and I think we all believe in, that the world of science and research is a pan-Canadian question, and that it shouldn't, it really, that sense of opportunity and so on, we really want to ensure that it really is coast to coast to coast and not something. But the way it's organized now in the public policy world and so on, it's kind of exposed the fact that things can happen in provinces that really undermine and fly in the face of Sean. How do we have those kind of tough discussions? We poke at them a bit in the case of health, but I think in the world of higher ed, without the federal government, our research and innovation ecosystem would not look at all like it looks today. It was the federal government, starting back in the day, but especially from the 1960s on, that took leadership and said, this is a national issue. Federally, we have to take this. What do we do now? Because you're
It says 4 minutes. I think there's obviously something to that, and I don't envision a world where the federal government is withdrawing from that leadership role. I talked earlier, for instance, about the key pillars of the federal science portfolio, and I envision that those will, broadly speaking, remain unchanged should the government change. I do think, though, if I can depart from your question, is you asked Rachel about language, and I don't want to get pedantic, but I do think this matters. One of the best things the sector has done in recent years is gradually replace the notion of discovery research with frontier research. It's such a better way to think and talk about what's happening on campus. We are living in one of the most exciting moments in my lifetime when it comes to potential breakthroughs in a number of areas. Artificial intelligence is going to match the contribution the creation of the internet made to our economic and social lives. We're seeing out of the pandemic extraordinary opportunities coming out of mRNA vaccines and other medical technological developments. There's really exciting stuff happening in the world of clean technology and the energy transition. The list goes on and on. After what some have characterized as a period of stagnation, we're on the cusp, I think, of a kind of scientific revolution. And that's exciting. I think that's something that people want to opt into. And so I like the notion of conceptualizing the work that you're doing is on the frontier of conceiving of a different and better future. Rachel's comments have emphasized the extent to which 7 out of 10 Canadians say the country is broken. Roughly two-thirds or three-quarters are skeptical that their children are going to have better lives than they've had. Some of that, of course, is responsive to very particularistic kind of microeconomic developments, but part of it is that we've lost, for various reasons, some of them demographic, some of them socio-political, et cetera, that exciting, vibrant conception of the future. And you and your institutions are on the front lines of that future. And I would encourage you to talk about it that way. I mentioned an article or a speech that we published in America earlier. We also did a 6-part podcast series with the University of Toronto recently that I'd encourage people to check out. I talked to scholars who are doing extraordinary things with organs on a chip technology, or who are making major breakthroughs when it comes to drug delivery systems. And that's cool. That's futuristic. That's a picture of the future that I want to be part of. And I think a lot of Canadians do as well. And so it's a very long way of saying, if I have some overarching messages today, the first is refocusing or rebalancing the way you think and talk about yourself, placing as much emphasis on education and training as you do on science and research, recommitting yourselves to place. But I also think elevating the extent to which you and your institutions are on the front lines of some of the most exciting developments occurring, ones of which are going to transform the way we work, transform the way we live. I think that's really cool, and I think that that would resonate with people who increasingly feel like that type of exciting future isn't on offer.
And Rachel, your point though is to make sure that the benefits of that get to everyone.
Yes, and communicate how that's happening.
Right.
I don't think that's readily apparent right now.
Well, we're coming down. I want to thank you all so much for your participation in this and for sending in the questions that I didn't read question for question, but I hope we got in there. I want to just ask you to join me in a warm round of applause for Rachel and Sean.